As Mazi said, my name is Aaron Williamson. I'm the Director of Governance at the Symphony Software Foundation. We are not the platform provider for the Symphony software. That's confusing. I understand that, and I'm going to resolve that confusion for you in just a moment. But I'm going to talk to you about the case for an open FinTech ecosystem. So the Symphony Software Foundation, what is it? How is it different from Symphony? It's the question I answer every single time I come to an event. We are an industry-wide open source foundation. We are an open source foundation for the financial services industry. We, like any open source foundation, like the Linux Foundation, like the Apache Software Foundation, host a number of open source projects that our members collaborate on. We, as Mazi was just discussing, we run a number of working groups, including the desktop Wrapper API working group, where the work on the OpenFin Symphony integration began. We run a number of conferences, meetups, and other events where we bring together people who are doing or interested in doing open source work in the financial services sector. And we do member-directed research and advocacy, for example, around moving banks a little closer to comfortability with open source and collaboration on open source. You can see a list of our members off to the side. OpenFin is one of our most active members, and we're grateful to them for having us here. So what is the point of having an open source foundation specifically for financial services? We have the Apache Software Foundation, we have the Linux Foundation. Why do we exist at all? There are three reasons, as you'll see on your screen. I think the most important to our members, the banks specifically, is trust. They want to know that if they're collaborating with other banks on an open source project, that they are doing it in a place where one of their competitors can't shut them down, can't take it in a direction that is unsustainable for their own goals. We offer a transparent governance so that if you want to be involved in the open source project that you are contributing to, there is a path for doing that, and you understand how that project and the working groups are working. We take care of managing the IP around an open source project so that when you publish a project through the foundation, we scan the code to ensure that it's compliant with open source licenses. And we also scan it for known security vulnerabilities in the open source components that you're using. And so we provide a place where banks can confidently and comfortably collaborate on open source and understand that we're taking care of some of the more difficult aspects of that for them. We also think that our focus on financial services is important. Banks want to know that they are coming to a place that understands their particular needs, especially in the sort of IP and regulatory compliance areas. We have, we're working with the banks to develop workflows for development that work for banks. Banks can't necessarily go out and collaborate quite as enthusiastically as the rest of the software industry, and so we're helping them along in that way and providing them a developer experience that works for them. And we take care of helping to foster the growth of the open source projects that are hosted in the foundation. So we help to build the network of users around a project. We help to bring events to the public where we can showcase projects, and we advise projects on how to sort of grow their community around open source, which is something that banks don't do a lot of. When I first got to the Symphony Software Foundation, I didn't quite realize, I came from the open source world, I didn't quite realize how much work we had to do before we could fulfill the fundamental purpose of enabling banks to collaborate on open source software. As you might be aware, banks are a little bit secretive, and they are a little bit hostile to one another sometimes, and they're also very concerned about regulatory issues, et cetera. And so we have been working with banks and doing a lot of work, including by hosting for the first time this year the Open Source Strategy Forum, which was an industry-wide event to bring together people who are talking about open source in financial services and doing open source in financial services. And so we're doing a lot of that sort of community building work to bring the industry to the point that every industry eventually gets to, where they are collaborating together in the open on shared infrastructure that is non-differentiating between banks. And so we're helping them, as I said, to overcome the legal, cultural, and technical challenges that banks in particular face when trying to collaborate on open source. And now we're finally seeing a lot of the fruits of that work. We're seeing that banks are beginning to actually be ready to collaborate on open source. Just in the last few months, we had 2 of our members who are major banks finally adopt their first internal open source contribution policies that will enable their developers to actually go outside and contribute source externally. And that was partly facilitated by the work of the foundation. We've seen a major contribution from Deutsche Bank. Their very first open source project ever was a contribution into the foundation, and we're facilitating that project and the community around it. And the reasons that are driving banks in this direction are they want flexibility in the tools that they're using. They want to be able to, they want interoperability, as Mazi said, between the different parts of their workflow. They want to avoid lock-in to an individual vendor. They want to avoid more Bloombergs. So we've seen this sort of validated in the tech press. We've seen growing sort of interest there. And we saw a massive community come together at our event earlier this year, the Open Source Strategy Forum. We doubled the target attendance at 300 people, and we had individuals from many major banks present and attend. And what Mazi presented, and or rather what Nick just presented, is I think an excellent example of how we see open source bringing value to financial services and financial technology. The OpenFin guys, Nick in particular, collaborated with other members within a working group in the foundation to define the API, the desktop API for the new sort of Symphony HTML5 app, so that it would meet the needs of other containers. And then Symphony built their container in the open, and OpenFin took a look at that, figured out how to sort of adapt their own product to that API and integrate Symphony seamlessly into API, or rather into OpenFin, and then they open source that integration into the foundation. This generates value for the entire ecosystem. The vendors get, such as OpenFin and Symphony, they get new on-ramps because they're interoperating with platforms that their customers are using. And the end users get competition at the solution level where they can plug components in where they might have been using others. They avoid lock-in to individual vendors. They have the opportunity, we're seeing this with a lot of the banks, the reason that they're using Symphony, the reason that they want open APIs is that they can customize their trader workflows in a way that they couldn't do with other solutions. And they get the ability to focus on core products. So if a bank, if integrating Symphony into OpenFin allows a bank to standardize on OpenFin and stop sort of focusing on their own container, then they can start, they can stop being a container provider for their own business and start doing more of being a bank. And that's our purpose in the foundation, is to sort of catalyze these high-value collaborations where it's a win-win for the vendors and for the end users, the banks. So the point of the talk, the whole ecosystem benefits from open platforms. Everyone in this room who is a vendor is providing a particular piece of value to their customers. But that value is not necessarily the sort of fundamental platform. That value is, maybe it's the network, maybe it is the data, the special data that they're providing on top of their platform. Maybe it is the apps at the edge of their platform. But what I guess the message here from the foundation is there's an opportunity to open source below that value line. And you as a platform vendor get a lot of value out of that. You're the platform vendor, you're the nerd with the glasses, and I think an invalid HTML tag. But the value you get out of open source is that you can commoditize the sort of type of product that you're providing. So if you've got 15 vendors out there providing a container and trying to sort of wrestle a little bit of market share for that, and one of them open sources in a way that enables a wider variety of the industry to sort of standardize on that. Even if not every single one of them is going to be a customer of you, the provider of that open source platform, you've commoditized out from under your competitors and moved the value of the container application to the special things that you're doing that they're not. You enable the possibility of community and customer contributions to your code base, which enables you to provide more value without putting in as much value or putting in as much time and effort. You have a scalable go-to-market strategy in the sense that you can offer something. You don't have to convince a bank to adopt your platform business-wide, pay you for it for every seat. They can test it out in small ways, and they can decide in a more sort of scalable way how they want to roll out across their businesses. And you can focus on the core value of what you're providing instead of trying to be the only provider of that kind of platform. And of course, the banks get out of this avoiding lock-in to a particular vendor. It lowers their cost of ownership for all of these things. They have workflow self-determination. If they can take your component and plug it into their workflow because you have made it open and available to them to do that, that increases the value for them. They can take a look at your code and they can ensure that they are complying with their security regulations. And they can contribute to the new features that they want to see in your platform. I mean, we see this with even extremely well-funded FinTech startups, that you cannot keep up with your customers' feature list. And a lot of banks really want to solve some of those problems themselves. And if you provide them the ability to do that, that makes your platform a little more sticky for them. So that's why we exist. I hope that I've been at least a little bit convincing why open source in FinTech is happening and is going to continue to happen, and why banks are going to want it. If you want to talk to me about how this fits with what you're doing, talk to me anytime. Thank you.